Go through that Atari would have done all the promotion for Nintendo here in America and released it. So this really has no bearing on what eventually happens, but by postponing it, things did go down the way they went down. So that's a little bit of an interesting note on a little bit what happened. And you know what's the reason why our Nintendo made such a big deal of this too is Coleco owned the rights to make the games for the home consoles for their Donkey Kong games. Or all their games, I guess it would be.
Well, but I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Arnold Greenberg was in Japan and saw Donkey Kong and realized nobody had brought it home. And he was on the phone instantly trying to make a deal because he saw the potential of this thing and nobody was savvy enough to be jumping on this. Atari, as we spoke about with Ray Kassar at that time, not being savvy enough to understand the game industry and what makes a game good and all of that. He was strictly a businessman, whereas Arnold Greenberg really had an eye for this stuff and said, we got to have this game, this is going to be huge. And bringing that home and putting it as a pack-in game helped move millions of those systems, because this was the name at the arcade, you know, along with Space Invaders and Pac-Man, which Coleco didn't get the rights to. This was the one that hadn't been scooped up, and they were so savvy in picking that up.
Yes, and as I mentioned before, they had the home console rights but they did not own the computer rights. So this is why it was a big deal whenever they're showing this off on their Atom system. They don't have the right to do this at this point, and that's where it becomes a big divide over this whole thing. It becomes, you know, those legal rights, they're huge, you know, the fine print whenever it comes down to it.
Speaking of legal rights,
really take this seriously. Go ahead, Ray.
Speaking of legal rights, there was actually some problems with the game having a lot of legal rights problems. Apparently Universal thought that Donkey Kong, the original arcade version of Donkey Kong, was far too close to their character, King Kong. So they tried to sue both Coleco and Nintendo when they saw this, because they saw that Coleco got the home rights and was manufacturing the game to release with the ColecoVision. So this caused some problems for both Coleco and Nintendo. So Coleco, Greenberg met with Universal, and Sid Sheinberg, who was running Universal, who was one of the main head honchos at Universal at the time, was being a real, like, you know, pushing the issue. But turns out Nintendo unleashed Howard Lincoln, their brilliant lawyer, on them, and he went and found a court case that only happened a few years earlier, when Universal actually tried to get the rights from the original creator of King Kong, RKO.
Ooh, fine print.
So what happened was
details.
Universal proved in court that it was fair use, because the copyright had expired.
Look at that. They screwed themselves out of it.
And Howard Lincoln found this and pointed it out to him and said, well, hey, look, it's not fair. You said it was fair use. So we're going to...
Well, a little bit more about that. Howard Lincoln won that court case for them, and Howard Lincoln would become a pivotal member of the Nintendo team and later president of Nintendo of America. And this is one of the early precedents that made him a household name. They needed a lawyer, or not a household name, a household name for us. But
here at Video Gamers headquarters. No doubt.
But I mean, a successful company needs a good lawyer, and especially for cases like that. You know, if he had not found that and let Universal have their way, we may have never seen this as successful as it was. But he found that little loophole and said, you yourselves said that this was a fair use item. And of course, the name Donkey Kong was actually a big mistranslation to begin with. Whenever they translated it, they thought they looked up the word for ape, and they found, what was it, Kong, in their translation, and donkey came from the term jerk or ass, stubborn. So stubborn ape became Donkey Kong, and they didn't realize that they had infringed on anything. They had no clue when they named this game. You know, they could have easily just named it Monkey Shines or something.
And then George Romero would have been pissed. But what can you do?
None of it would have happened. So
and and I want to touch on something else really quick. You know, this Donkey Kong has made grown men cry, and if you don't believe that, check out the documentary or the film, whichever you prefer to call it, The King of Kong, about Steve Wiebe and Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell being of the classic arcade era fame. Their rivalry over the game Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., which they don't touch on much, but Steve Wiebe did steal the high score from Billy Mitchell and Donkey Kong Jr. as we're playing.
Yeah, the two. Well, Billy Mitchell for years was the Donkey Kong world champion.
He is the gamer of the century, and we're not going to deny that.
And there's a reason, because Donkey Kong's regarded very highly, because there's a lot of random events. It's hard to get through all the screens, and it's very challenging. So in the early arcade scene, it was considered a real testing ground, and that documentary fully breaks down the history and the rivalry between these two guys.
Nice.
To be the King of Kong, to be the high scorer. And that's how pivotal this game was. This was the game that made Nintendo a huge success in the industry, and at the same time, when brought home, made Coleco a huge name in the industry. So a lot of history with this game, and if you haven't played any Donkey Kong yet, then you gotta try at least Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr. Avoid 3 though. Donkey Kong.
Avoid that with the bugs and the
Donkey Kong 3
Galaga,
sucks.
Space Invaders. But like I said, also check out that documentary or film or whatever you'd like to call it. It's a good time. I shared it with many people and they've enjoyed it. Or check out Chasing Ghost Beyond the Arcade, an even better point of view on classic arcade games and the people involved with them.
And I would also recommend checking out Donkey Kong Math, because that one's not bad.
That's an interesting title, but that's for another thing altogether.
What is that on? What systems is that?
Nintendo NES. Well,
Donkey Kong Math. We're gonna have to hunt that down one of these days and do some math.
If you haven't had enough,
yes, Donkey Kong Jr. math, because Donkey Kong, of course, already knows math. Young Junior here is learning.
Needs to learn, absolutely. But I think we've had enough of Donkey Kong talk, so we're gonna move on to our next game.
Okay, here we're looking at a game from Taito, who made their name with Space Invaders, and all of a sudden became so huge. Space Invaders, the game, became so huge that there was a coin shortage in Japan because all the arcade machines were sucking up the quarters. So Coleco once again tries to pick out some of these games that weren't brought home yet, that were arcade hits. This one, not quite as great as Space Invaders, but not a bad game. Frontline.
Yeah, it's a top-down type shooter game. Kind of in the same tradition as like a game as like Gunsmoke and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a lot, very similar to Gunsmoke. And I like how they do the kind of jig walk there. I thought it kind of reminded me of Cowboys, the way they just kind of saunter in there.
Yeah, it's got a kind of a strange walking mechanic.
You don't see many games where the players saunter.
It's not in Television Running Man.
If you own ColecoVision, you already own a powerful state-of-the-art computer that gives you the arcade experience with the newest arcade games like Donkey Kong Jr., Looping, Pepper 2, Time Pilot, Mr. Do, Space Fury, Frontline, arcade controls like Turbo, the Roller Controller, and new Super Action Sports. And soon you'll plug in Atom, the revolutionary ColecoVision family computer module with new Super Games, keyboard, and printer. ColecoVision, the only system you'll ever need.
NewGenGamers.com.